Hey everyone, it's Sean from Crafted Elements, and in this video we're going to be looking at the Crafted Elements Eco Router Sled. Specifically, we're going to be looking at what you need to assemble it, how to put it together, and how to use it. Then we actually have three different router sleds to choose from here at Crafted Elements. We've got our original router sleds, which are made of industrial grade linear motion components, so they're literally aluminum and stainless steel components, custom milled, custom fabricated acrylic pieces to put it all together. It is literally the highest quality router sled you can buy, but it obviously comes with a higher ticket price. We also have our trim router sled, which is using the same quality industrial components. Again, those linear motion components often found in CNC machines and 3D printers and things like that, but on a smaller format designed for trim routers. So it's our trim router sled. Now the Eco Router Sled, which is what we're talking about today, and otherwise the Economy Router Sled, is kind of a good hybrid. It's better than what you would make at home using plywood and wood, but it's obviously not the same quality or caliber as our industrial grade kind of automation components and our full-size router sleds. So what we've done is we've actually taken a lot of the fabrication and guesswork out of making a typical router sled like you would see like in a DIY video on YouTube, and we've made all the components that require any sort of rubbing together, any sort of friction, out of a very cool industrial plastic. This is HDPE, which is high density polyethylene plastic. Has a pretty low coefficient of friction, especially compared to plywood or other types of plastics. If you put two pieces of plywood together, you know that it doesn't slide very, very well. And when you're seeing these kind of DIY router sleds on YouTube, typically made of plywood or whatever scrap, maybe even melamine that's put together, they're not great. They sort of work, but they're not great. We've taken that up to that next level by giving you super high quality, low friction plastic to essentially use for any components of your router sled that are moving or touching each other. So in the Eco Router Sled kit, you're going to get the following panels. You're going to get the router carriage base. Now this is the main part that will slide on the rails. You'll build some plywood walls for this, and essentially your router runs down the middle of it to route and level your project. You'll get the rail toppers. So once you build your side rails out of plywood or whatever stock you're using, these will go on top to make them very, very low friction. You get your rail stoppers, which go at the end of the rails. And you get your carriage stoppers, which is essentially going at the end of your router carriage to keep the router carriage not only stable, but also on top of your rails in a parallel fashion. And then you're going to get a universal router plate, which is simply a piece of acrylic with a hole drilled out of it. And you can mount your router to this. It is an optional item. It does come with the kit, but you do not have to use it if you choose to use your own router base. We'll get into why you might want to use that a little bit later on in the video. Now, as this product sits between a actual DIY built it yourself at home solution and a ready to go, ready to assemble solution, there's going to be some parts and components you need to provide and fabricate. So first of all, you're going to need a router. Now, our system is universal. It does come with a 6x6 square router plate that will slide really, really nicely in between our carriage, but you could actually use a router plate that's included with your router. And again, it will work with any router. Trim routers, full-size routers, it doesn't really matter because there's nothing specific about a hole pattern, unlike some of our other router sleds. You're going to need a spoil board bit. Honestly, we just get these from Amazon. I think this one's from SPE Tool. Now, depending on the router you're choosing, you're going to want to choose an appropriate spoil board bit. A lower power trim router, such as this, 1.25 horsepower, you're not going to want to go any more than 1.5 inches diameter, whereas a larger router, such as this, or even something bigger like a Triton TRA, which is like 3+ horsepower, you can use, a full-size 2.5-inch spoil board bit with replaceable carbide blades like that guy. Again, from Amazon. You're going to need some 1-inch construction screws and some 1.5-inch construction screws. You're going to need a plywood base or a workbench or a tabletop. So I've got some 4x8 sheet of plywood I'm going to put down on my tabletop to assemble it, but of course you may already have a 4x8 or 4x4 tabletop, depending on the configuration you're assembling here, to use for this. The next thing you're going to need is a piece of 2x4 foot, 3/4 inch plywood, or a separate piece of 4x8 by 3/4 inch plywood. Now the plywood is going to be used to assemble your risers for your rail toppers. It's also going to be used to assemble the side walls for your router carriage. So it's important that it is 3/4 inch. You're going to want to use plywood Don't use chipboard or OSB or MDF or melamine or whatever. You want to use a quality structural plywood. I've got Baltic birch here, but you could easily use maple or oak or even sanded pine. Like this is actually sanded pine. Just a quality rigid plywood that's 3/4 inch is going to be what you're going to want to choose. Now, one of the cool things about the Eco Router Sled kit is that you can actually build 2 different configurations of router sleds, or 2 different sizes, if you will. You can do 4 foot by 4 foot or 4 foot by 8 foot. Same components, except in the 4 foot by 4 foot section, you do not actually need these. You can either throw them away or store them for later. I would recommend storing them for later in case you want to expand your router sled down the road. Now, we're going to get into the actual cuts you're going to need to make. Now, we do have a piece of paper, a little instruction sheet with each one of these kits that actually has a drawing of the cuts you're going to want to make for a 2 by 4 foot panel or a 4 by 8 foot panel to actually determine the pieces that you're going to want to cut on your table saw. Now, the most budget-friendly way to make the wood components of this is to use a pre-cut 2 by 4 foot piece of plywood, and that's really because you're going to have very little remnants left over. Whereas if you use something like this, a full sheet of 3/4 inch plywood, you're going to basically use this much of the sheet and have the rest in remnants, which is also not wide enough to use as your tabletop base. So unless you've got a spare sheet of 4 by 8 plywood or kind of a section of 8 foot plywood available in your shop, just go and get a 2 by 4 foot handy panel that's 3/4 inches. So if you're assembling a 4 foot by 8 foot configuration using a 2 by 4 foot handy panel, you're going to want to cut it with your table saw into 2.5 inch wide by 40 inch long strips. You're going to cut 8 1.5 inch wide by 48 inch long strips. You're then going to take 2 of those 48 inch long strips and cut them down the middle. So you're going to end up with 6 1.5 by 48 inch long strips and 4 1.5 by 24 inch long strips. Now, if you're building a 4 by 4 foot configuration instead of the 8 by 4 foot configuration, you're going to really need half as many of those strips. So you're going to still want to cut 2 of the 2.5 inch by 48 inch long strips, but you're going to need 4 total 1.5 by 48 inch long strips. Again, this is using the 2 by 4 foot handy panel to build a 4 by 4 configuration. Now, if you happen to have that 4 by 8 foot piece of plywood hanging around, or a section of 3/4 inch thick 8 foot long plywood hanging around, then you're going to really just want to make a few simple cuts. You're going to want to make one single 2.5 inch by 96 inch long cut, and then you're going to cut that in half to end up with 2.5 inch by 48 inch long pieces times 2. Then you're simply going to cut 4 of the 1.5 by 96 inch long pieces, and that's going to essentially act as your rail base. Now, it's important to note that you may need more of those 1.5 inch strips depending on the type of material you're going to be milling, specifically the thickness of that project or thickness of the material you're going to be milling. If you have a really thick project, your router and your router bit's going to need to sit higher to accommodate the thickness of that project. And the thing that's determining the height of the router, the entire router carriage, is those 1.5 inch strips of plywood underneath our 1.5 inch rail toppers. You can always add additional height in the future by adding additional strips, but what we're recommending here is kind of the most common configuration to make it the most functional for 90% of the population. So I'm going to go ahead and take this 2 by 4 foot handy panel over to my table saw. I'm going to cut out the configuration to make a 4 foot by 96 inch long router sled, and we're going to get assembling, which is of course the fun part, right? Take 2 of those 48 inch long strips and cut them right down the middle, roughly 24 and 24. So as you can see here, I've got all my plywood components now cut up. I've got the 2.5 inch wide, 48 inch long sidewalls for my router carriage. I've got the risers for the side rails. So I've got 6 that are 1.5 inch by 48, and I've got 4 that are 24 inch by 48, and you'll see why I did that in a sec. So I'm going to go ahead and put the riser that side and focus on building the router carriage. I said earlier you're going to use some 1-inch, 1.5-inch screws. Realistically, you could build this entire thing with 1-inch screws or 1.25-inch screws. I just recommend the 1.5 to get it further into the sidewalls to make it more structurally rigid, but in my honest opinion, I don't think it's going to be that much different than using 1-inch screws. So if you only got 1-inch screws or 1.25-inch screws, it's fine. Again, number 8s is what you're going to want to use for this. All these holes are pre-drilled to accommodate number 8 screws. Assembling this is super simple. You could pre-drill these if you want, but now these holes are laid out in such a way that they're going to be right in the middle of a 3/4-inch panel, which is why we suggest using those 3/4-inch panels. And you're just going to line it up, butt it up nice and flush the sides here, and go for it. So we've got the router carriage walls obviously attached to our plastic plate. Now it's time to install the router carriage wall end stops, which are these guys. Now you'll notice there's a ridge or a groove here. That's to represent where you would line it up at the bottom of this plastic. So the top of this groove should be flush as possible with the bottom of this. That's because this distance is a little less than the thickness of this. So this little channel that's created under here is what's going to allow it to ride on those rails. So again, don't install it flush like this. You'll want to have it kind of like this. So you've got almost 1/2 inch between here and here. So use this as a reference guide. Now, if you want to use this screw hole, which is designed to go into here, there's no pre-drilled screws or pre-drilled holes in here. You're going to want to use a drill bit 1/8 inch or less to pre-drill a hole in that, because I can tell you that trying to drill a fresh hole right through there with a screw without having a pre-drilled hole is going to be a disaster. I'm going to go ahead and use the side of my workbench to line this up to pre-drill some holes to get this in place. So if you use screws too long here, you'll end up hitting the screws that are going up here. All right, and you'll see the function of that is to allow this thing to slide and not come off the side rails, and let's flip it around and do the other side. Well, that actually completes the process of assembling our router carriage, and you'll see how rigid and inflexible this thing is now compared to the piece of plastic that you received in your kit, right? So once it gets mounted to those plywood rails, everything kind of straightens up and becomes super rigid, obviously, which is what you want to slide your router across. So I'm going to go ahead and put this to the side. We'll come back to that to attach our router once we're ready. And I'm going to grab this thing. Now, I could go ahead and install these rail risers right on my workbench here. This is a 5 by 10 foot HDPE workbench. I don't obviously want to permanently mount those here, so that's why I've got my piece of plywood here. But if you wanted to, if you've already got a 4 by 4 foot or a 8 by 4 foot workbench with a flat top, then you could literally mount those risers right to your workbench. Or you could do what I'm going to do, just grab a piece of flat plywood. In this case, sanded pine, oak, bolted birch, maple, even MDF. MDF is not a great material to work with when you're building like structural things, but MDF makes a great spoil board, which is basically what you would use on most CNC machines because it's dead flat pretty much, right? So as long as you have support underneath that's level and flat, your board will be level and flat. That's really the key I want you to take home here, guys, is we want a flat top, okay? Level is actually not that important because your rails are going to be equally unlevel. If your workbench or your table is unlevel, you know, this way, whatever, your rails are going to be equally unlevel, and therefore you're not going to have any distant difference between your router or router bit and the bottom of your tabletop where your material is going to sit. But if your tabletop or workbench or whatever is not flat, so you've got maybe like some grooves or some humps or some bumps or whatever, that's going to cause a problem because you're essentially going to mimic that in your piece. So whatever you do, listen to my word of advice. Make sure whatever you mount this to is nice and flat, is screwed down to make sure it's flat. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get my flat piece of wood and put it on my flat tabletop and get these mounted. Going to reiterate here in case it's not obvious, but if you're building the 4x4 foot configuration, you don't need a 4x8 sheet of plywood. You need a 4x4 sheet of plywood, so a 4x8 sheet cut in half, or again 4x4 foot workbench or larger to be able to mount everything to. But of course I'm building the larger configuration, but the instructions and the way you'd build a 4x4 foot configuration are exactly the same, you're just making it smaller. So what I'm going to do is mount our rail risers to this guy. Now these, we're going to want to stagger them. So we should have a total of 96 inches this way, and therefore when we lay these guys out, we've got 96 inches this way as well. Now the key is, you may be thinking, well, why didn't I just cut, why don't I just stack them like this? The issue is that now you've got your seam here in the middle, and your pieces of plastic is going to go on top of these, and you're also going to meet that seam. So if there's any sort of deviation, even a micromillimeter, you're going to possibly see that in your wood. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the base, 2 4-foot sections, and then we're going to use a 4-foot section in the middle and 2 2-foot sections on the extents. What that's going to do is essentially building it like a brick house or like Lego blocks, keeping the seams away from each other and allowing us to get a nice smooth run when we attach our plastic components to these rails. So attaching these to your workbench or your piece of plywood or whatever you're using is completely up to you. You could use screws, you could use wood glue, you could use what I'm going to use. I'm going to use my brad nailer. It doesn't matter. Do whatever you want. As long as they're attached and secure, that's all that matters. Once they're attached and secure on both sides, you're going to be able to take your piece of plastic and the rail toppers and put them on top. A 4-inch piece, again staggering the seams here. 48-inch piece. And the last 24-inch piece. I'm going to quickly go around to the other side, do the same thing. Now before you attach your plastic rail toppers to your side rail walls here, just do a quick test fit to make sure that everything's kind of lined up, that your router carriage is sliding along. Yeah, so everything's good. So if it was obviously not fitting on, we want to space out these rails a little bit closer together. Deviations in plywood, whatever, right? So just make sure that you've got your router carriage able to slide here. Now once that's done, you're going to go ahead and grab your rail toppers. Going to grab your drill and your 1-inch or 1 1/4 or 1 1/2 inch screws, and literally just attach this to with all the pre-drilled holes. And make sure it's down flat. You do not want any humps or gaps in this thing. When you get here, you're going to want to pay close attention to this interface. This is extruded plastic, so it will be the same thickness, but if there's any deviation, you want to account for that, even if it means, taking a little bit of sandpaper and just, rounding off that square edge to make sure that there's no hump or bump there for your router sled carriage to get attached to. Now that you've got your rail toppers installed, you're going to install your rail stoppers on each of the 4 corners and just align them in such a way that they are screwing into the plywood and then leaving a sufficient amount of material up here to actually stop your router carriage before it slides off the side. Go ahead and grab my assembled router carriage and just place it on top. And there you go. So it definitely slides nicer than it would if you were sliding plywood on plywood, and that's the entire point of this prefabricated system. So the next thing you're going to want to do is just grab your router and your router bit and either place it in the carriage and start going to town on your pieces, or you can mount your router to our included 6x6 inch router plate. And the beauty of this thing is that it fits right in here with very little gap and allows you to get a nice even cut. The problem is if you're using a router base that comes with your router that's smaller than this distance, which is like 6 1/8, you are going to maybe have a slightly wonky cut, which really doesn't matter in the end when you're sanding your piece, but it's just nicer to have precision. All right, so what we're gonna do is take a minute to take this, grab one of our routers, and we'll attach it to our router base. So I've got this brand new scale router that I just grabbed from Amazon, and you can see I don't want to say an issue, but it's just, you've got a little bit of movement there, where you would not have that much movement if it was attached to this router plate. Not all routers are going to fit this way. You're going to have some, especially trim routers, that are much smaller diameter, which are going to have a lot of movement. In that case, this router plate is probably really important. You'll probably be noticing right now that these handles will cause a problem. So depending on how you want to mount this, you can definitely do it this way and leave the handles on. If you, for whatever reason, need to mount your router like this, switches or whatever adjustments, you'll want to take your handles off. So most of these routers will have a hex screw or whatever type of set screw that you can actually remove these handles altogether, and then you'll just push it using the top of the router and not the handles. So again, that's completely dependent on the router that you're going to use for this. Handles on, handles off, the effect is the same depending on how your router sits and how it's going to work and how you need to operate it. So again, I'm going to mount mine like this. I don't need to take the handles off. I'm just going to make sure that I mount it to the base accordingly. So the easiest way to mark your holes on this is to take off the router base that came with your router and then just trace those mounting holes. If you don't have your router base, you can still do it. You'll just want to do it the opposite way. So instead of using this to trace onto this, you'll just take your piece of acrylic, and again, there's a little sticker on this thing, and line it up this way. And you'll see we have etched centers here. So you got this crosshair that represents the center. So get it as close to center as possible, and then just mark your mounting holes this way. But for utmost precision, we're going to use our router plate all right, got our hole locations marked. Grab yourself a piece of scrap material. So when you drill through this, you're not drilling through your workbench or your router table in this case. And start with a small diameter router bit to drill a pilot hole, something less than 1/8 of an inch. And then you can progressively drill larger holes. The reason you don't really want to attack this with a large bit right away is because it is acrylic, and if you get too hard on it, it will snap. Have some patience and drill small holes to begin with. I've got my holes drilled. We can use our existing screws. You may have to get longer screws depending on the length and size of the router plate that came with your router. You'll see here that I got my holes are an accurate size, but I'm going to need to countersink this because I don't want the screw head riding above my router plate and essentially riding on my plastic. Plus, when I countersink it, it's going to allow that screw to go all the way through. Likewise, if I still have really short screws, you're going to want to countersink it and get yourself some longer screws that will fit your router. Every router is different. Generally, they're metric screws like an M4 thread with varying lengths. I've got my countersink bit. Pretty easy to get at a hardware store or Amazon. It doesn't really matter which side's up. We've got etching on one side, etching on one side, but otherwise it's a symmetrical design. Just make sure that it's going to line up with your router when you actually drill these holes. Obviously you want to take care not to drill all the way through this router plate with your countersinking bit, otherwise your screws aren't going to do anything. All right, so bring back our router, line our holes back up, and reattach the new plate to a router. And of course, you're going to want to save your router plate in case you ever want to use your router for a different application than the sled, so definitely hold on to that. All right, so we can just install that into our channel of our router carriage, and there you go. You've got the acrylic base sliding nicely on your plastic to obviously reduce the amount of friction here, and that's going to just make your job a lot easier when you're pushing this router and shifting this base to level something. All right, so we have a fully assembled Crafted Elements EcoSled, 96-inch long, 48-inch wide, ready to do some damage. Before I do a demo of how this thing's actually going to work, I want to talk about some considerations and limitations in terms of maximum stock thickness, router bit configuration, things like that. So one of the questions that frequently comes up with our router sleds is the thickness that you can mill. If you recall earlier in the video, we created these 1.5-inch risers to build up these walls that we put our plastic pieces on. And I said that the vast majority of people will be okay with 2 sets or 2 layers of these risers, essentially 1.5 inches before you put the plastic on, which basically means with the plastic you have 2 inches of height. So from the base of the table to the other side of this carriage, we've got 2 inches, which means anything 2 inches or under will fit under here, and you can of course use the router to level it. But if you've got thicker stock, maybe a 3-inch thick table or something that you want to do, in that case, you're going to want to cut some additional risers and put them underneath this. Most people aren't going to ever really need to mill anything 2 inches or higher. However, if you do, then this is the case where you're going to want to cut another set or maybe 2 sets of risers to increase the height. So if you put another layer of 3/4 inch plywood or 1/2 inch plywood or whatever it is, underneath this, you're going to increase the available maximum thickness leveling ability by that amount. Okay, so if you add another section of 3/4 inch panels, you're going to have 2 3/4 inch of maximum height. If you add another 2 sections of 3/4 inch panels or 1.5 inches of additional height, you're going to have 3.5 inches of maximum slab leveling height. So then the only thing you have to consider is if you do raise these rails up by adding additional plywood underneath these plastic sections, you're obviously going to have a higher router carriage, a higher router. What if you want to do a really thin piece of wood and your router and router bit won't reach down because now it's elevated? Well, glad you asked. 2 ways around that. First way is you can add a second piece of plywood on top of this for that smaller project. So, in case you're not following, you take another piece of plywood. MDF is probably really good for this. You put it down, temporarily secure that piece of plywood to your base table. I'm going to get into how to secure these pieces in a minute. And then you take your project and secure it to that raised piece of plywood. Now your piece or your project is higher, so your higher router sled, your higher router can get to that piece of project. So again, that's only a consideration if you've raised the rails to a point where now they're too high for that router to reach a thinner piece of stock. Now, There is another option, and that is called a router collet extension. Wow, that was magic. This is a 1/2 inch router collet extension. Again, from everybody's favorite retailer, Amazon. It basically allows you to take a router bit with a 1/2 inch shaft, put it in this guy, and make a super long router bit. All right, so if you have your router higher and you've got a really low piece of stock, you can use something like this to get that extra reach to get down further. In general, I wouldn't use a router collet for every project, or a collet extension for every project. I think in the 1/2 inch configuration, it's very secure, very safe. They do make them in a 1/4 inch. I don't know if I trust a 1/4 inch shaft that's 5 or 6 inches long with a giant spinning bit on it. So I kind of only recommend these router collets or the collet extensions in the 1/2 inch configuration for full-size routers, if that makes any sense. All right, so again, if you raise up your rails by adding additional plywood and you want to get down a little bit further and your router won't reach, router collet extension on your router bit, or put down some plywood and then mount your project to that to raise your project up. Now this brings us to the next section of this video before I get to the fun part, which is how do you hold down your pieces? All right, so let's get rid of this. A lot of people struggle with when it comes to using our router sleds is like how to properly secure, your project. If it's a charcuterie board, it's actually really easy. A charcuterie board or a table that is, rectangular or square, it's actually really easy. I use 3 different methods when we're using our router sleds. The hot glue method, which is kind of good for everything. It's like duct tape. Corner bracket methods, or using these little L levels. Or spare piece of wood method. So it should be pretty self-explanatory how to use these little aluminum squares. And basically, again, you can get these from Amazon, Temu, pretty much anywhere. I think even like local hardware stores would have them. Very, very common. I think it's like a 6 inch or a 5 inch square made of solid aluminum. And it makes a great hold down because they have these built-in channels and holes where you can literally just take some screws, drive them into your board, and you will not be able to move this thing. All right, so that is the first option. The second option is, like I said before, the sacrificial or spare slash, excess pieces of wood that might be laying down in your shop. You either screw this down or, tack it down with a couple of brad nails that you can come out later, and you've secured your piece. Gobs of hot glue are ridiculously strong, no matter what anybody tells you. So in this configuration, if I wanted to hold this down with glue, which I actually wouldn't, because because it has a rectangle or square edge, I would use one of the other methods. But if I wanted to, I would take some hot glue and just create some puddles around the corners, maybe in the middle, to keep this in place. Now, if your project that you're putting on here is not a simple table or a charcuterie board that's got nice square edges, never fear. You can kind of use a mix of those methods to hold it down. Probably primarily that hot glue method because it's probably the easiest. So I've got just here a wonky piece of walnut, kind of bowed in the middle. It's like 14 inches wide, so clearly you can't fit it through a regular shop planer, but this would be the way to do it. I would probably start off by mounting it this way to get as much contact as possible. Well, you get the idea, okay? This isn't an exact science, it's more of an art. All you want to make sure is that for the sake of your safety, for the router table, and for your piece that you're working on, that it's secured properly. So we're going to go ahead and level a couple things. I've got my 2.5 inch SPE tool spoil board bit. Again, this was from Amazon. Kind of a neat thing. It's got replaceable carbide blades that as you wear them down, you can actually untighten these, flip the blades around, and tighten them back up. So basically you get 4 uses out of them before these blades are destroyed, which is super handy. So I'm going to go ahead, put this on my router, and we're going to get started by mounting this to the table and leveling it out. Pretty simple to install one of these guys, and you can do it with your router base on if you actually have used the router base that's included with our kit. Okay. I've mounted in such a way that at least 1.5 times the diameter of the bit is in the router. Okay, so if you have a limited length of shaft, and you want to get further down your table, you have to kind of use your common sense here to mount this bit. You just definitely don't want it hanging out there with the risk of it coming off. So the general rule of thumb is 1.5 to 2 times the diameter is how far you want it in. So if I've got an inch, I've got a 1/2 inch shaft, I want it 0.75 to 1 inch into the actual router itself. So to fix my piece of the table, I'm just gonna throw in a couple of brad nails. These are 18 gauge nails, and that'll make removing them easy. I can just pry this right off and pull the nails out, not a big deal. Now the way we're gonna start this is by taking off generally at most 1/16 of an inch at a time. So you've got quite a bit of height difference here. It might be hard to see on camera, but it's got a hump in the middle and it's lower on the sides. So we're basically going to align our router and get the router bit sitting on this and then adjust it until we have it level. So our bit is basically sitting nice and flat right on the top of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to back this off a little bit. You can see that it's not sitting flat here because that's a lower part of the wood. And then we're going to just bring it down at most 1/16 of an inch. Because again, we don't want to be crazy aggressive with this. If you try to take off 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, your router's going to get bogged down, it's going to bounce everywhere, and you're going to ruin your piece. So you just is like a multi-pass situation where you want to do 1/16 of an inch, maybe even 1/32 of an inch per pass, and level it out before you go to the next reduction in height. So once we actually gone through this and leveled this section out, we'll lower this out again by 1/16 of an inch or something, and then do the rest of it until we have a nice flat board. So you can see the highest part of the board, which is this section, is now leveled, and everything else I'm doing is not catching the router bit. So at this point we're going to go and lower the router bit a little bit and then continue again. Now I've come this far, but before I finish this off and do the next set of layers to get rid of the rest of the roughness, I want to talk about some techniques and tips and tricks in using this particular configuration of router sled. Now, as you know, as I said earlier in this video, we have our higher end full-size sleds which use linear motion components, and they will basically give you perfectly smooth movement in either direction every time. The router is essentially locked in place in those, so you can actually move the carriage and go this way, or move the router and go this way. You don't really have that luxury with a sled like this because you can't really easily move this, because you need two hands, and hold the router. So, you know, this seems like it could be a little bit dangerous. So you really are limited to positioning your carriage in place, running your router maybe once or twice as I've been doing, and then shifting it over to the next section. So in terms of going with the grain or against the grain, in this case you don't really have a choice. It doesn't necessarily matter though. Your big router bit is spinning in a direction like this, so I'm not convinced the finish this way is going to be any different than going this way, but to each their own. In the end, once you've leveled this out and you sand it, I guarantee you're not going to notice the difference. With that also said, let's talk about these little lines. You may see these super faint lines here, and that's very common with any router sled, whether it be this guy or a bigger guy, or even our CNC machines. Our CNC machines here, using a spoil board bit like that, will create these super faint lines as it makes each pass. As long as you physically can't feel them and they're like actually like up and down with your finger, they're going to stand out. That's very, very normal, whether you're using a router sled, a CNC, or whatever. It's not really avoidable when you're using a bit like this and making multiple passes in all sorts of directions. You're going to have those bit lines, or those tram lines, so to say. Now, with regards to going back and forth on these things, you've noticed sometimes probably that I've done multiple passes without shifting. And that typically means that I've found that the router might be riding on top of the wood. So you've done a pass, maybe it's a little bit too deep and the router's come up a little bit on that sled. Our other router sleds, which are again, the higher end versions, they're locked in place. They can't physically go up. You cannot lift up the router like this. So it's stuck in place. You only have that issue. But in this configuration, you definitely want to do 1, 2, possibly even 3 passes before you shift and move on to the next. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're using something like this where the router is essentially free floating. You want to make sure that if you do one pass and you just move on and the pass wasn't deep enough, you're going to have those very obvious ridges. So again, those are a couple of things to make note of. I'm going to go ahead and reset this over here. I'm going to lower that router bit again by 1/16 of an inch, maybe a little bit more, and then finish off this board and move on to another project so you can see the capabilities of this bad boy. So I'm happy enough with that finish. Obviously we still got a bit of roughness here, but whatever project I'm making, it's gonna act accordingly. Probably not end up using that section. But I can go ahead and remove this wood and it is ready for sanding and finishing. Now I'm gonna go and pop these guys off my board, those temporary pieces of wood that I put down here, and then remove any sort of nails that might be left over. Now let's go ahead and mount another project to this. We're going to use this to mount, to level an epoxy and wood cutting board. Now when you're melting epoxy with one of these router sleds, it's really important to note that when you're going over the epoxy areas, you want to go slower. The speed that I was using this at in terms of moving it back and forth with the walnut, doesn't matter if it's on wood, but if you try that really quickly on the epoxy, and I can even show you what happens, you're going to get tear out and it's going to make a mess. Not that it ruins your board, you can basically fill in your epoxy with some clear epoxy, let it set. But to avoid that, just make sure you're going a little bit slower when you're doing epoxy projects rather than solid wood projects. Now, mounting this to this size of router sled, in all honesty, is kind of overkill. This will fit through my shop planer, but then I wouldn't be able to demonstrate the router sled for you. So let's pretend it's a bigger piece that wouldn't fit through a regular shop planer, or maybe you don't have a regular shop planer. In that case, then this router sled is going to be perfect for you. So I'm going to go ahead and mount that with our little aluminum squares, doing like this, and grab some 1-inch screws and screw our squares down into the wood to keep the project in place. So again, same methodology here, guys. Line this thing up, find the highest part of the board, get the router bit sitting right on top of it, and then come back, lower it a little bit, and go to town. All right, so I'm gonna put my PPE on, and we'll get leveling this piece. Now guys, before I conclude this video, I want to look at a couple of key points and takeaways that are important, especially if you're considering buying or building a router sled. Now our Crafted Elements EcoSled kit is a very cool solution if you are a hardcore DIYer and you want to build something at home, or alternatively, if you simply don't have the budget for one of our premium router sleds made with industrial grade automation components. In all aspects, they are a better product. The build is better, the accuracy is better, they're easier to use, they slide a lot better despite having this plastic that's going to reduce friction. They are a better product. They have dust collection abilities. They've got pre-drilled holes for your rudder plate. There's just a lot going for those products. However, they are notably more expensive. So really the key takeaway is if you're looking to buy or build a router sled and you want to keep the costs down, but you want to save time or maybe get a performance improvement, this is the ticket. We've pre-drilled all the holes, we've pre-cut all the important parts. You have to supply very, very little plywood, obviously, to put the thing together, but you're going to get this low friction plastic, and it's again all pre-fabricated for you. So it's going to save you a lot of time having to build, and you're going to get a better DIY router sled that's above what you would build if you're, what you would get if you were building it with plywood or melamine or whatever, right? So really the takeaway is if you have the budget, go for one of the premium sleds. If you don't have the budget or you don't have the need for a large sled all the time, maybe you've only, you're doing 1, 2, 3 projects a year that you can't do in your shop planer, then this is probably something that you'd want to consider. Now you can shop the entire line of Crafted Elements router sleds at craftedelements.com, including the EcoSled kit, including our premium original router sleds, and including our trim router sled. Now guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did or you didn't, leave a comment below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I hope you found this super informative. Bye for now.